There are two men in this story. One has a crown, a title, and blood from a dynasty his ancestors built through conquest, alliance, and a decisive theological choice that altered the course of Western European history. He sits on a throne. Nobles acknowledge him. Bishops address him by his royal title. Official documents bear his name as King of the Franks. He travels through his own kingdom. And everywhere he passes, people treat him with the deference that 2.5 centuries of tradition have attached to whoever sits in that position. The other man has none of this. No ancient bloodline that his world recognizes as sacred. No title that the political culture around him treats as inherently legitimate. But he commands the armies. He manages the Frankish nobility. He makes every decision that determines whether the kingdom survives the next campaign season, the next noble revolt, the next challenge from a neighboring power. He has been doing this for years. Everyone around him knows it. Soon, one of them will cease to matter politically. Not through war, not through plague, not through assassination or battlefield defeat, through a question sent to Rome, and an answer that returned from Rome, and a ceremony in a city whose location had not been chosen accidentally. In that ceremony, a pair of scissors closed and long hair fell to the floor, and a dynasty that had organized the Frankish world for 2.5 centuries dissolved in the time it takes for hair to fall. This is not a story about who won. It is a story about how winning actually works when the rules are still being written. About what happens when the language that makes power feel legitimate exhausts the conditions that sustained it. About 3 generations of patient work required to build a different language of authority, and the single ceremony in which that new language finally replaced the old one. What you are about to hear draws on chronicle sources, archaeological evidence, and the work of historians who have spent careers with this material. Where the evidence is solid, this account says so. Where it is thin, contested, or shaped by the agendas of those who recorded it, this account says that too. Some questions have remained open for 14 centuries, and this account will not pretend otherwise. 2 dynasties, 1 kingdom, a transfer of power so carefully arranged that the man who lost everything walked quietly into a monastery, while the man who arranged it called the outcome inevitable. It was not inevitable. Nothing about this story was inevitable. This is where we begin. Einhard wrote his biography of Charlemagne sometime around 830 of the Common Era, roughly 80 years after the events at the center of this story. He was a scholar who had spent his entire adult life at the Carolingian court, educated and employed under Carolingian patronage, writing for an audience whose understanding of its own political world was organized around the legitimacy of the dynasty that had taken power in 751. His professional standing, his sense of his own place in the intellectual culture of his era, and his career in its entirety depended on the rightness of what the Carolingians had done. He had no institutional incentive to be fair to the people his patrons had replaced. With that context in mind, consider the image he chose when describing the dynasty Charlemagne had replaced. A Frankish king, descended from the most powerful royal line in post-Roman Western Europe, traveling through his own kingdom, not on horseback at the head of a military column, not in a carriage that announces his rank and demands the appropriate response from those who see it pass. In an ox cart, pulled by farm animals, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who has nowhere particular to be and no particular urgency about getting there. Beside him, or ahead of him, or perhaps simply somewhere else entirely doing the actual work of governing, is another man, armed, purposeful, moving quickly towards something that matters. This image has followed the Merovingian dynasty through 12 centuries of historical writing. It appears in textbooks and popular histories and documentary narrations as though it were a straightforward description of observable reality. It has shaped how generations of people have understood this period and this dynasty. It is also the image that a man writing to celebrate Charlemagne would choose. And that fact matters for how we receive it. Einhard had every professional reason to make the Merovingian predecessors look as diminished and as irrelevant as possible. To make what happened in 751 feel not like the seizure of a throne by an ambitious family that had spent 3 careful generations positioning itself for exactly this moment, but like the natural and overdue correction of a situation that had long since ceased to make sense. The image of the king in the ox cart, slow and ceremonial and pointless while capable men did real work around him, is doing exactly that kind of political labor. The image may contain some truth. Some of the late Merovingian kings were young when they came to the throne, short-lived, and genuinely removed from practical governance. But before accepting it as a complete or accurate portrait, it is worth pausing on a question this account will return to, with every major source it uses. Whose interests does this serve? And what did the person who created it need its audience to believe? That question is the first tool this story requires, not because the sources are pure invention, but because they are never neutral. The chronicles describing the Merovingians were written by churchmen with strong views about what distinguished good kingship from bad. The biography that framed the transition was written by a man whose career was built on celebrating the family that won. These sources are not useless. They are the best we have. But they require the kind of reading that never entirely forgets what the writer needed the reader to believe, and holds that awareness throughout. What happened between the Merovingians and the Carolingians was not a single night of violence, a battlefield defeat, or a sudden collapse. It was a process that took 3 generations, a family that understood, with unusual clarity, that the gap between holding power and holding the recognized right to hold power was a gap that could be widened deliberately, patiently, and without forcing an open confrontation that might fail, and a dynasty on the other side of that gap that had arrived. Through a long series of individually reasonable short-term decisions made by people responding to immediate circumstances, at a position from which recovery was no longer possible. When people call what happened in 751 a palace coup, they are using the word loosely. It was a coup in the sense that one ruling family replaced another. It was not a coup in the sense of soldiers seizing a throne in the dark. It was something more like a legal argument, a theological negotiation, and a carefully designed sequence of public ceremonies, each constructed so that a radical act, the end of a 3-century dynasty, would feel to everyone watching like the natural conclusion of something already decided. The Carolingians were very good at that kind of thing. The Merovingians, at their height, had been very good at something different. They understood that the foundation of political authority is not the army you can field, or the treasury you can fill. It is the story people tell about why you have the right to be where you are. They built that story with considerable sophistication across 2.5 centuries. Their kings were powerful not simply because they won battles, but because their subjects, noble, and bishops believed, in a way that went deeper than political convenience, that something different ran in Merovingian blood, something that could not be manufactured or transferred or revoked by any human decision. The Carolingians, when they finally moved, did not argue against that story directly. They built a different story alongside it, one that did not depend on blood at all, and waited for the old story to exhaust the conditions that had sustained it. That shift, from one theory of legitimate authority to another, is what makes this story matter beyond the fate of 2 specific families in 8th century Gaul. The question of why any person or institution has the right to hold authority over others is one of the permanent questions of organized human life. The Franks in the middle of the 8th century were thinking about it practically, with real consequences for real people. Who do we follow? And why? What makes a king a king? when the person on the throne and the person governing are two different men? Which one is the real king? The answer they arrived at in 751 shaped how those questions were answered in Europe for centuries afterward. And the process by which they arrived at it is what this story is here to trace. The man in the ox cart had a name. His dynasty had a history that Einhard needed his readers to remember badly. That history is where we begin. Soissons, 486 of the Common Era. Clovis is 19 years old. He leads a Frankish force against a man named Syagrius, who has been governing a small enclave of Roman-administered territory in northern Gaul for roughly a decade. Syagrius still uses Roman titles and applies Roman administrative forms. The empire that gave those things their meaning has been gone for a generation. But Syagrius is still there, still performing the rituals of an authority that no longer exists in any practical sense. Like an actor continuing to speak his lines after the theater has emptied, Clovis defeats him. Syagrius flees south to the Visigoth kingdom. Clovis sends a message demanding his return. The Visigoth king calculates that sheltering this particular fugitive is not worth the trouble of antagonizing a Frankish king who has just demonstrated what he is capable of, and hands him back. Syagrius is executed. Most histories treat that sequence as a minor military footnote. It was considerably more. What Clovis did at Soissons was not simply win a battle. He sent a message to every Frankish chieftain, every Gallo-Roman aristocrat, and every bishop managing a city in northern Gaul. The Roman world was finished. Something new was beginning. The only question now worth asking was who would define what the new thing looked like. Clovis understood something that most of his contemporaries either did not grasp or did not grasp early enough. Military force could take territory. Holding territory was an entirely different problem, one that force alone could not solve. Governing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers required people who could manage records, adjudicate disputes according to recognized standards, coordinate communication across vast distances, and provide the administrative continuity that turns military conquest into stable political authority. In the world of the late 5th century, those people were concentrated almost entirely in one institution. When Roman civil administrators had withdrawn from the cities and provinces of Gaul, the bishops had stayed. They managed urban infrastructure because infrastructure needed managing, and they were the people with the capacity to do it. They maintained records because records were essential, and they were the people capable of maintaining them. They settled disputes between neighbors who had no other authority to appeal to. They communicated across hundreds of miles through networks organized around religious obligation rather than imperial command. They were literate in an environment where literacy outside church circles was becoming genuinely rare. They had been accumulating practical administrative experience for the better part of a century before Clovis was born. And they possessed the institutional memory of Rome in ways that no other surviving organization did. They also needed what Clovis had: military protection. Clovis married a Burgundian princess named Clotilde around 493 of the Common Era. Gregory of Tours, whose chronicles are our most important narrative source for this period, presents the marriage with considerable spiritual emphasis. A pagan king drawn toward the faith of his devout wife. Gregory was a churchman with strong reasons to frame historical events in theological rather than strategic terms. The strategic dimensions were real. A Burgundian princess brought connections to Gallo-Roman aristocratic families and access to ecclesiastical networks that a pagan Frankish king could not otherwise reach. The conversion that followed is one of the genuinely contested questions of early medieval scholarship. The date most commonly cited is 496 of the Common Era, connected by Gregory to a battle against the Alemanni tribe. Ian Wood, in his study of the Merovingian kingdoms, published in 1994, argued that the actual baptism may have come considerably later, and that the circumstances were shaped by political calculation, running alongside whatever personal experience Clovis had. The exact timing remains debated among specialists. What is not debated is what the conversion accomplished. The other major Germanic rulers of Clovis's era had adopted a form of Christianity whose central theological positions the Council of Nicaea had condemned in 325 of the Common Era. The Visigoths held these positions. The Ostrogoths under Theodoric held them. Most of the powerful Germanic kings who had divided the former Western Empire had aligned themselves with the theological position the institutional church found wrong. Clovis chose the other side. The Nicene position. The orthodox one. The one the bishops recognized. The response was immediate and consequential. The Gallo-Roman bishops of northern Gaul sent letters of congratulation and offered cooperation. They treated Frankish royal authority as something they could work with in ways that a king holding different theological positions could never quite be for them. Clovis gained. Through a single decision. People who knew how the post-Roman world worked and who had real reasons to help him govern rather than resist him. He gained the institutional memory of Rome. Preserved inside the one organization that had survived Rome's fall with its networks largely intact, his subsequent campaigns reflected that alliance directly. The wars against the Visigoths in southern Gaul were framed as a Catholic king, freeing Orthodox Christians from a ruler whose theological positions the church condemned. Whether ordinary Frankish soldiers cared about the theological details is doubtful, but the framing gave bishops of southern Gaul compelling reasons to welcome rather than resist Frankish advance, which made the military campaigns considerably more manageable than they otherwise would have been. By 511 of the Common Era, Clovis controlled territory stretching from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Built in roughly 30 years from a regional chieftaincy in what is now Belgium. Then he made the decision that planted the fault line into the foundation of everything he had created. He divided the kingdom among his 4 sons, among the Franks. As among most Germanic peoples of the period, a man's possessions passed to his sons collectively when he died. Land, weapons, obligation, followers. All of it distributed among the heirs, rather than concentrated in a single successor. The practice had genuine social logic. Sons excluded from inheritance became resentful and dangerous. Keeping them tied to the family through shared inheritance maintained cohesion and reduced internal conflict. Applied to a political structure covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Held together not by institutional machinery but by military dominance, personal loyalty, and the specific church alliance that Clovis had built through 3 decades of deliberate investment. The same logic became something else entirely. A mechanism for guaranteed fragmentation. A built-in process for converting the unity that had made the dynasty powerful into the division that would make it vulnerable. Clovis could not have thought about his kingdom any other way. The concept that a kingdom was categorically different from a private estate. Something with an integrity, independent of the family holding it, and too consequential to divide. Had no framework in Frankish cultural practice within which to express itself. He applied the logic his world gave him to a situation that logic had never been designed to handle. 4 kingdoms, where there had been one. Austrasia, Neustria, Burgundy, Aquitaine. The conflicts that followed lasted for 3 generations. Clovis gave his sons a kingdom. He did not give them away to keep it whole. The gap between what he created and what he failed to institutionalize is, in many ways, the entire story of the Merovingians compressed into a single decision made in 511 of the Common Era. A Frankish king has been captured by a rival branch of his own royal family. He is alive and uninjured, held somewhere in conditions that are uncomfortable but not dangerous. His captors are standing over him with a decision that has no good options if you think carefully about what each one produces. They can kill him. Killing a king creates a martyr. His name becomes a cause. His blood creates vengeance, obligations the culture treats as binding, and that can generate conflict for generations. His children become dangerous rather than manageable. His allies have a compelling reason to organize resistance rather than accommodate the new arrangement. An execution might resolve the immediate problem of his continued existence and produce 5 harder problems in its place. Or they can cut his hair. The blades close. The long hair falls to the floor. The crisis is over. The man who commanded armies and held the loyalty of thousands of Frankish warriors becomes, in the moment, the blades close, politically irrelevant. His supporters do not rally. There is nothing to rally around. He is escorted to a monastery, where he will spend the rest of his life in quiet religious obscurity. He does not become a cause. He generates no vengeance obligations. The world continues as if he had never been a king at all. This happened multiple times in Merovingian history, and the fact that it worked, that everyone involved treated it as a complete and natural resolution, tells us something fundamental about what Merovingian kingship actually was beneath its ceremonial surface. In political systems most familiar to modern audiences, authority is institutional. A president is powerful because of the office, not because of anything particular about the person who holds it at a given moment. Remove the individual and the office remains, ready for whoever fills it next. The institution outlasts any person. The individual is, in the theory of institutional authority, replaceable without disruption to the underlying structure of governance. Merovingian kingship worked on fundamentally different assumptions. The institutional structures of the Roman world had dissolved across much of the former Western Empire. What remained was not institutional authority, but personal authority, of a very specific kind. The Merovingian king was not powerful because he held a title. He was powerful because his contemporaries believed, in a way that went deeper than political convenience, that something different was inscribed in his body, something connected to the mythological origin of the family at its founding, carried in his blood and expressed most visibly in his uncut hair, that placed him in a categorically different kind of being from the ordinary men around him. The long hair was the visible expression of that belief. In Latin sources of the period, the Merovingian kings were called by a phrase translating as the long-haired kings. This was not a description of personal grooming preferences. It was a constitutional designation, as specific and as consequential as any formal title. The hair was not something these kings happened to have. In the understanding of the time, it was something they were. It marked them as belonging to a different category of being from every other man in the Frankish world. The historian John Michael Wallace Hadrill traced the roots of this symbolic system in a study published in 1962, connecting it to older Germanic traditions in which hair length was associated with the status of a free warrior. Tacitus, writing his observations about Germanic peoples around 98 of the Common Era, described how certain tribes used hair and its cutting as markers of social standing. The Merovingians took something that existed among their ancestors as a cultural marker and elevated it into something considerably more powerful. A claim about the nature of their family and the source of their authority that could not be manufactured by any institutional process. Whether contemporaries explicitly connected this to the biblical story of Samson, a man in the Book of Judges whose exceptional qualities were bound up in his uncut hair and who lost both when his enemies cut it while he slept, is something the sources do not tell us directly. What is clear is that whether or not people made that connection consciously, the symbolic grammar was present and available in the culture around them, a symbol that resonated simultaneously with older Germanic traditions about status and with the new Christian framework reorganizing Frankish cultural life, was effective in ways that required no explanation and that reached multiple audiences through a single visible marker. Gregory of Tours records multiple instances of hair cutting deployed as what we might call political surgery, a way of permanently neutralizing a rival without generating the consequences that killing would produce. One episode requires careful handling because Gregory is our only source for it, and he had his own theological purposes, shaping what he recorded. After the death in battle of a Frankish king named Clodomir in 524 of the Common Era, his brothers faced the problem of Clodomir's young sons. Those boys had legitimate claims on their father's territory. Their continued existence as claimants created the possibility of future conflict. According to Gregory, and Gregory alone among surviving sources, the brothers summoned their mother Clotilde, grandmother to the boys, and presented her with a stark choice. Her grandson's hair could be cut, transforming them from royal claimants into private individuals, or they could be killed. Gregory records that Clotilde chose death for the boys over the cutting of their hair. We cannot verify this from any independent source. What the episode reveals about the symbolic system, regardless of its precise historical accuracy, is significant. A shorn prince had not been punished. He had been transformed, moved from one category of being to another, permanently out of the class of people for whom royal claims were possible. The political system had no mechanism for reversing this. A dead prince could become a cause. A shorn prince in a monastery was something the political system had no category for treating as a threat. He had been converted into a different kind of person entirely. As completely as any transformation the culture recognized, remove the threat without creating the martyr. Dissolve the claim without spilling the blood that demands answering. The cold elegance of it reflected a political culture that had developed a nuanced understanding of how symbolic systems could be used as governance tools. It was also, as it eventually turned out, the very instrument through which the dynasty would itself be dissolved. But before that, another mechanism was developing in the background of Frankish political life, one that no person had designed and that no one fully understood. When a king comes to the throne at the age of 3, someone else must sign the orders and manage the campaigns. When that pattern repeats across 2 generations, it hardens from emergency accommodation into institutional expectation. The senior official of the royal court, the major domus in the Latin sources, the mayor of the palace in English, starts making the decisions not because he seizes them, but because the person who is supposed to be making them keeps being unavailable. After enough repetitions, the expectation solidifies. The mayor makes decisions. The king presides at ceremonies. That is simply how things work. The gap between the king who is and the king who governs opens slowly. Through individually reasonable decisions made by people responding to immediate circumstances, until the gap is wide enough to walk a new dynasty through, understanding who eventually walked through it, and how they prepared for that walk over 3 generations, is the next part of this story. In 714 of the Common Era, in the Austrasian city of Cologne, a woman named Plectrude made decisions with the urgency of someone who understood that the next several days would determine whether everything her family had built would survive or dissolve. Her husband, Pepin of Herstal, had just died. He had been the dominant political figure in the Frankish territories for nearly 3 decades. The mayor of the palace, whose victory at the Battle of Tertry in 687 of the Common Era had established Pepinid dominance across the divided Frankish world in a way no previous holder of that office had achieved. He had governed effectively for nearly 30 years, managing the restless Frankish nobility, conducting campaigns on multiple frontiers, building the kind of personal authority that made the Pepinid name worth something to the warriors who had served under him. Now he was dead, and the inheritance was not going to transfer automatically. Plectrude controlled the court, the treasury, and the administrative machinery of the Frankish palace. Her plan was to govern through her young grandsons from Pepin's earlier marriage, children young enough that she could make decisions in their names. The arrangement was defensible. She had the resources to make it work, if she could contain the threats to it. The threat she was most focused on stood somewhere in the palace complex, in the form of a young man named Charles, Pepin's son by another woman. Born outside Plectrude's marriage, capable and ambitious in ways that anyone who had observed him could recognize, and bearing his father's name in a world where that name still meant something to the warriors who had spent years fighting under Pepin of Herstal. From Plectrude's perspective, a capable and ambitious man, with blood claims and a name that carried weight, was not someone she could afford to leave at liberty while she was trying to establish control of the succession. She had Charles imprisoned. He escaped. The sources do not record how. What followed was several years of violent, simultaneous conflict on multiple fronts. Charles fought against Plectrude's coalition managing the Austrasian court from Cologne. He fought against Neustrian nobles who had been waiting for a Pepinid moment of vulnerability to reassert their own independence. He fought against regional powers along every frontier, testing what the death of a dominant figure actually meant for the settlements he had imposed. He fought all of them at once, without the luxury of addressing them in sequence. By around 717 of the Common Era, Charles had won on every front. By 719, when Plectrude surrendered the treasury, the conflict was over. That crisis reveals something important about the Pepinid project that can be obscured by viewing 3 generations from too great a distance. What the family had built was not a guaranteed inheritance that transferred automatically. It was a network of relationships, accumulated advantages, and personal loyalties that had to be actively defended and sometimes fought for. The 3-generation arc was real, but it was never as smooth as it looks in retrospect. The first generation was Pepin of Landen, who died around 640 of the Common Era. He served as mayor of the palace in Austrasia under the Merovingian king Dagobert I, placing him at the center of the most effective Frankish court the 7th century would produce. What Pepin of Landen did with that position was build something more durable than any office. He cultivated relationships with Austrasian nobles that ran deeper than formal political obligation. He developed connections with the church in his region that gave his family credibility and allies in an institution that would eventually prove decisive. He accumulated land, and through land, the loyalty of warriors who depended on such grants for their material standing. When he died, he left his family a network. The 2nd generation extended that network through decisive military force at the right moment. At Tertry, in 687 of the Common Era, Pepin of Herstal won the direct confrontation between Austrasian and Neustrian factions that established him as the dominant figure across the Frankish world. He became mayor of the palace effectively across the entire kingdom, concentrating in his hands a degree of practical authority that no previous occupant of that office had held. He held it for nearly 3 decades, and across those 3 decades, he made a choice that reveals more about the Pepinid project than any military victory. He did not reach for the crown. By the late 7th century, the Merovingian kings on the Frankish thrones were largely ceremonial figures, young, short-lived, and functionally excluded from practical governance. Pepin of Herstal had more real power than any Merovingian had exercised in decades. He could have moved to claim the title that reflected the reality of his position. He chose not to, and the reason matters. He had power. He did not yet have legitimacy. Not the kind that the Frankish political world would accept without significant cost. The nobility expected a Merovingian on the throne. The church had organized its relationship with Frankish political authority around the Merovingian dynasty. Reaching for the crown without first addressing those expectations would have converted allies into opponents and staked everything on a confrontation he might lose. He was shrewd enough to see that clearly and patient enough to act on what he saw. He held power without the title, extended the family's position without disturbing the symbolic order, and left the next generation a foundation more solid than the one he had inherited. He also left the central problem unsolved. The gap between Pepinid power and any legitimacy that could sustain it across generations had to be closed by whoever came next. Closing it would require resources and tools not yet assembled. Charles, having fought his way out of imprisonment and through 3 years of simultaneous campaigns, was the person who would have to find those resources and tools. The world was about to discover what he was capable of. The morning after Charles escaped whatever Plectrude had arranged for him in 714, he had no organized court that recognized his authority, no treasury under his personal control, and no military force loyal specifically to him. He had a name that carried some weight from his father's reputation, enemies who understood that his existence was a threat to their arrangements, and whatever combination of clarity and nerve allowed him to see his situation without illusion and act on it without hesitation. 7 years later, he was the effective ruler of the Frankish territories. Unchallenged from any direction, the path between those 2 points ran through continuous, simultaneous, unforgiving conflict. He could not address his opponents in sequence. Plectrude's coalition, the Neustrian nobles, the regional powers testing the new situation. All of them were operating at once. He fought all of them and won. Not because victory was easy, but because he was better at exactly this kind of problem than anyone he faced. The men who followed Charles in those years followed him because they had watched him make decisions under conditions where the wrong decision meant extinction. And they had seen those decisions succeed. That kind of loyalty is different from the loyalty that land grants and family connections produce. It is harder to manufacture and considerably harder to dissolve. He governed the Frankish territories for 24 years without claiming the crown. That fact deserves to sit with us. 24 years of continuous, active governance of one of the largest political entities in Western Europe, campaigns prosecuted across an enormous arc of territory, from the Pyrenees to the Rhine Valley to the Saxon frontier and beyond. A restless Frankish nobility that required regular demonstration of where real authority resided, and that received those demonstrations as often as necessary. All of this conducted from the position of mayor of the palace, under the nominal authority of Merovingian kings, whose primary function was to be present at the ceremonies that required a king to be present. In 732 of the Common Era, a force from the Umayyad Caliphate advanced deep into Gaul, under a commander named Abd al-Rahman ibn Abd Allah. The Umayyad Caliphate had been expanding across the Iberian Peninsula for years, and this force had pushed well beyond the Pyrenees into Frankish territory. The engagement near the cities of Tours and Poitiers that followed became one of the most discussed and most inflated military events of the medieval period. The framing that grew around this battle in later centuries substantially overstated what the available evidence supports. The claim that it saved Christian civilization from Islamic conquest does not survive careful examination of what the Umayyad Caliphate was actually facing in 732: internal political tensions, significant logistical constraints at that distance from its bases, and practical limits on how far any force could project durable control over unfamiliar territory, were all factors operating regardless of any single battle's outcome. Historians who have worked carefully with the evidence of Umayyad politics and military capacity in this period have generally found the dramatic framing excessive. What the battle determined, for the immediate purposes of this story, was something considerably more direct. The Umayyad commander was killed. The advance was stopped. The credit was Charles's, visibly and completely. There was a Merovingian king on the throne during all of this. His name was Childeric IV. He played no role in any part of the military response. He commanded no forces, made no strategic decisions, contributed nothing to the outcome. Every person of consequence in the Frankish world understood whose leadership had organized the most significant military event of the generation. The gap between the man wearing the crown and the man who had organized everything that mattered was not subtle or deniable. It was simply the most dramatic illustration yet of what Merovingian kingship had become. Childeric IV died in 737 of the Common Era. Charles did not install a replacement. For 4 years, The Frankish kingdom operated without any Merovingian king at all. The machinery of governance continued functioning. Campaigns continued. Administrative decisions were made and implemented. The symbolic center of the political order had been removed, and the operational reality of the kingdom changed almost nothing. The Merovingian king had become so completely separated from the actual functioning of the kingdom that his absence caused no disruption worth noting. Charles died in 741 of the Common Era. He had governed one of the most extensive political entities in Western Europe for 24 years without claiming the crown. He left his sons a position more powerful in every practical sense than the kingship they technically served under. He also left them a problem he had not needed to solve for his own purposes. The Frankish nobility had grown uncomfortable with the empty throne. Raw power, however effectively exercised, could not simply overwrite 2.5 centuries of symbolic framework. The expectation that Merovingian blood occupied the throne was built so deeply into the structure of Frankish political culture that its absence created a gap that competence and force alone could not fill. Building a replacement for what was missing would require something Charles had never needed. It would require Rome. Charles Martel died in 741 of the Common Era. His sons Carloman and Pepin divided the practical work of governing the Frankish territories between them. The throne remained empty. For 2 more years after Charles's death, the arrangement held. Then the edges began to fray, not in a single dramatic confrontation. In the way that arrangements built around a specific person's authority show stress when that person is gone and no equivalent authority has taken his place. Peripheral territories that Charles's direct personal dominance had kept compliant began testing what the new arrangement actually meant for their practical autonomy. Nobles in regions that had long histories of tension with Pepinid dominance started exploring what they could now assert. Rebellions broke out in several areas, each individually manageable but collectively, indicating that something in the foundation of the Frankish settlement had shifted. The strain was not about the competence of Carloman and Pepin. Both were capable men managing the challenges they faced effectively. The strain was about the symbolic frame that 2.5 centuries of Merovingian rule had built so deeply into the structure of Frankish political culture that removing it created a gap that competence and force alone could not fill. The Frankish world expected a Merovingian on the throne, not from sentimental attachment to any specific person, but because that expectation was part of the framework within which Frankish political life had organized itself for as long as anyone could remember. Governance without a Merovingian king felt, to the people who made up the Frankish political world, like governance without something structurally essential. Carloman and Pepin went looking for a Merovingian. They found one in a monastery. The sources do not record which monastery, or how long he had been there, or what his life had been, before 2 powerful men arrived to retrieve him. His name was Childeric, the 3rd Frankish king to bear that name. He was a Merovingian. His blood was the right blood. Beyond those facts, the record is almost entirely silent about who he was as a person. He was taken from the monastery, given the ceremonial attributes of kingship, and placed on a throne in 743 of the Common Era. Whether he understood what role had been prepared for him, the sources do not tell us. The silence about his interior experience is complete. What the 8 years of record that follow tell us clearly is what kind of king he actually was in practice. He did not command armies. He did not make strategic decisions. He did not manage the nobility or negotiate with external powers or shape policy in any direction the evidence preserves. The councils that determined the actual course of governance were convened by Carloman and Pepin. The military campaigns were planned and led by Carloman and Pepin. The administrative decisions that determined how the kingdom functioned day to day were made by Carloman and Pepin. Childeric III attended ceremonies. He received the formal acknowledgments that Frankish political culture required to be directed at whoever occupied the throne. He existed, visibly and publicly, as proof that the symbolic order had not been broken. He was a king the way a flag is a country. The flag is not nothing. Its presence matters, and its absence creates real problems. As Carloman and Pepin had just discovered across the 2 years between Charles's death and Childeric's retrieval from his monastery. But the flag does not govern. It represents something that exists and operates elsewhere. When the underlying reality changes, you change the flag. Childeric III was the flag. Now consider what this arrangement reveals about where the Carolingians actually stood in 743. They had the military record, the noble networks, the church relationships, and the institutional control that any ruler would need. They had demonstrated, across 6 years without a Merovingian king, that the kingdom's practical machinery did not require the sacred bloodline to operate, and yet they had gone to a monastery to retrieve a man they would present to everyone around them as the legitimate ruler of a kingdom he would never actually govern. Not because they were forced to, because they understood, with unusual precision, the difference between power and legitimacy. Power is what you can make happen. Legitimacy is what makes the people around you accept that you have the right to make it happen without requiring constant enforcement. These two things overlap considerably in practice, but they are not the same thing. And in moments of transition, the gap between them becomes visible and consequential. The Carolingians had power. They did not yet have the kind of legitimacy that would make that power permanent, heritable, and durable across the deaths of individuals and transitions between generations. The new framework was being assembled through years of cultivating church relationships, sponsoring ecclesiastical reform, and positioning the family as the Frankish lay authorities who would deliver what Rome had long been requesting. But it was not complete in 743. So they retrieved a placeholder while the assembly continued. Carloman withdrew in 747 of the Common Era. The sources describe genuine religious conscience, an increasing inability to reconcile the decisions that governing the Frankish world required with his own understanding of his obligations. He retired to monastic life in Italy. Pepin was left alone. One man, the concentrated power of the Frankish territories, a nominal king on the throne whose symbolic value diminished by the year. The question that had been accumulating for 3 generations was now unavoidable. Not whether Pepin had the power to replace Childeric. He clearly did. Whether he could do it in a way that would generate legitimacy durable enough to survive him and heritable enough to pass to his sons, that was a question nobody could answer for themselves. It required something from outside. He sent a message to Rome. The question Pepin's ambassadors carried to Rome in 750 of the Common Era was short enough to fit in a single sentence. Which man should rightly be called king? The one who holds royal power, or the one who holds only the royal title? Read it quickly, and it sounds like philosophical inquiry into the nature of legitimate authority. Read it carefully, knowing who sent it and what Pepin needed the answer to accomplish. And it reveals itself as one of the most skillfully constructed political instruments of the early medieval period. Every element of that question was deliberate. The framing was deliberate. The binary structure it created was deliberate. The impossibility of answering it at all without endorsing one of the 2 specific alternatives it presented was deliberate. Pepin was not asking Pope Zachary for theological guidance on an interesting, abstract question. He was requesting authorization to make a specific move. Through the form of a question so carefully structured that only one answer was logically available. The question created a binary with no escape. Either the man with power is the rightful king, or the man with only the title is. No third option. No possibility of discussing whether the current arrangement, with its separation of real authority from nominal authority, might have its own legitimacy. A choice between 2 things, one of which was the existing situation. Pope Zachary was not politically naive. He led an institution with pressing concerns of its own. The papacy was under significant pressure from the Lombards, who controlled much of the Italian peninsula and whose relationship with Rome was not comfortable. The Church needed reliable military protection from a powerful Frankish ally who was genuinely committed to providing it. What it currently had was a de facto relationship with Pepin. Regardless of who held the formal title, Zachary answered the question the way the question was structured to invite. It was more fitting. He replied, "For the man who actually governed to bear the title of king." That answer, from the most authoritative ecclesiastical voice in the Western world, did not formally depose Childeric. It did not condemn the Merovingian dynasty. It answered a question about rightful kingship in a way that left no logical basis for the existing arrangement to continue. The answer had been given. Now it had to be staged. Before following what happened at Soissons, something about the structural change, this answer was helping to create needs to be named directly. Because it shapes not just what happens over the next few years, but what happens in European political history across the following 3 centuries. The Merovingian claim to rule was grounded in what the family was: sacred blood, long hair, mythological origin, a quality inscribed in their nature that no institution could create or revoke. The Church had recognized and cooperated with that legitimacy for generations without creating it. The legitimacy existed independently of ecclesiastical involvement. What Pepin was constructing was legitimacy that worked on different principles. At the key moments of its establishment, institutional acts of recognition and endorsement were becoming one of the public conditions through which Carolingian authority was being stabilized and made harder to contest. The Church was not simply recognizing something that existed independently of it. It was becoming part of the mechanism through which the new dynasty's claim was publicly established. A king whose legitimacy is grounded in his own nature cannot have that legitimacy revoked by any institution. The Church can refuse to cooperate with him, but it cannot cancel what is inscribed in his blood. A king whose legitimacy has been publicly stabilized by institutional endorsement stands in a different relationship to that institution. The question of what happens when the endorsing institution becomes unhappy with the endorsed king is not one that was being asked in 750. They were focused on the immediate problem. That question would present itself in January of 1077. In a courtyard in northern Italy. In snow. But that is a later chapter. For now the answer had been given. What it immediately made possible was a ceremony at Soissons, whose location had been chosen with the same care and deliberateness as the question that had preceded it. Pepin did not have to choose Soissons. The Frankish kingdom had royal estates, administrative centers, and significant cities distributed across a vast territory. The gathering of nobles, required for a formal election, could have been hosted at any location with adequate facilities. Paris had historical associations with Frankish royal life. Rhine Valley cities had stronger connections to the Pepinid power base in Austrasia. The logistics of assembling the relevant noble class would have been manageable from multiple different starting points, and no practical requirement forced the choice of Soissons over any other option. Pepin chose Soissons because Soissons carried a specific historical memory that no other location in the Frankish world could provide. And because that memory was exactly the frame he wanted surrounding everything about to happen there. Soissons was where Clovis had defeated Syagrius in 486 of the Common Era. In the historical consciousness of the Frankish political world, it was the origin point. The Roman world had ended at Soissons. The Frankish order had begun at Soissons. The chain of political continuity that ran from that founding moment through 2.5 centuries of Merovingian rule had its visible beginning at that location. By choosing Soissons as the site for the transition from one dynasty to another, Pepin was communicating something that no formal proclamation could have conveyed with the same efficiency. He was not ending the Frankish political order. He was continuing it. The transition he was about to accomplish was not a rupture but a fulfillment. The latest chapter in the story that had run from Soissons since 486 He was writing himself into the origin story rather than positioning himself as its replacement. That kind of symbolic communication, the deliberate use of a location's historical memory to shape how an event is understood and remembered, is one of the arts that effective political operators have always practiced. Pepin was exercising it with considerable skill, and the choice was visible to the people who witnessed what happened there. The nobles assembled. The process of formal election proceeded. Pepin was chosen as king by the collective assent of the men whose assent the Frankish tradition recognized as making kings. The outcome may not have been in genuine doubt, and everyone present probably understood that, but the form was legitimate by the standards the Frankish world recognized, and the form mattered. Then Boniface performed the anointing. Boniface was an English churchman, born around 675 of the Common Era in what is now southwestern England, who had spent his career under explicit and documented papal authorization to reform the church in Germanic territories. He had convened councils, established proper canonical procedures for ecclesiastical appointments, and aligned Frankish church practice with Roman standards in ways that the papacy had been requesting for decades. He had done all of this with the consistent and active support of the Carolingian family, which had provided the political framework within which his reform program could operate against the resistance of bishops and abbots whose comfortable arrangements his reforms threatened. The man who placed his hands on Pepin and performed the ceremony that was formally transforming him into king was a man whose career had been made possible by Pepinid patronage, who represented a reform movement the Carolingians had invested years in cultivating as their institutional ally. The anointing was ecclesiastically legitimate by every applicable standard. It was not independent of the family being crowned. The church that confirmed Pepin was, in the specific person of Boniface and in the broader reformed network he represented, a church that the Carolingians had helped to build into the institution capable of providing exactly this kind of confirmation. That is not a criticism. It is a description of how institutional partnerships work when they work successfully. Both parties received what they had been working toward. The anointing at Soissons was the moment that long. Mutual investment paid out. Then the hair was cut. The sources record this and move on, treating it as a procedural formality, accompanying the more apparently significant ceremonies of election and anointing. Within the symbolic logic of everything the Merovingian dynasty had been and built across 2.5 centuries, cutting Childeric's hair was the central act of the entire sequence. Everything else that happened at Soissons had precedence in Frankish practice. Assemblies had chosen kings before. Churchmen had blessed Frankish rulers before. The hair cutting was different in kind. It was the application of the Merovingian dynasty's own most fundamental symbolic instrument to the dissolution of the dynasty itself. The instrument they had invented, the instrument they had refined and deployed across 2.5 centuries against uncounted rivals and inconvenient relatives, now turned against them by men who had studied the system carefully enough to understand exactly what it required and what it would accomplish. Recall what the long hair meant. The visible expression of a claim about the nature of the family. The claim that something had been placed in the blood of this lineage at its beginning that could not be manufactured or transferred or arranged by any human decision. The claim that Merovingian kings belonged to a different category of being from other men. A shorn prince was not a prince who had been punished. He had been transformed, moved from one category of being to another, permanently out of the class of people for whom royal claims were possible. The political system had no mechanism for reversing the transformation. When the blades closed on Childeric's hair at Soissons, the dynasty that had governed the Frankish world since 481 of the Common Era was dissolved in exactly the terms the dynasty had always used to describe the permanent removal of a royal claimant from political life. Childeric was taken to the monastery of Cithieu, near what is now Saint-Omer in northern France, later known as Saint-Bertin. He entered the monastery, and the record about him grows thin. His later life, the name he may have taken as a monk, the year of his death. None of these details survive in any source that remains. The thinness of this record is consistent with the ordinary fragility of 8th century documentation, which was radically incomplete and which preserved information about private individuals in monasteries inconsistently for practical administrative reasons. It is also consistent with a new dynasty, having had reasons to prefer a former king, who existed in the record as a concluded matter rather than a continuing presence. Both factors were almost certainly present. How the balance between them shaped what was or was not preserved cannot be determined from the evidence we have. The transition was formally complete. Pepin left Soissons as king of the Franks, the first Carolingian to hold the title rather than merely the practical reality of the position. What Soissons had produced was real and significant. But one element of what the new dynasty needed was still missing. The papal contribution had been an answer to a question carried by ambassadors. The ecclesiastical confirmation had been an anointing by an authorized churchman. What had not yet happened was a direct, personal engagement from the center of Western Christianity itself. Not through representatives, in person, on Frankish soil, with the full weight of the office present rather than delegated. 3 years later, a pope left Rome and began the journey toward the Alps. In the autumn of 753 of the Common Era, Pope Stephen II left Rome, heading north toward the Alps. Popes did not do this, not as a matter of routine, not as a practical necessity of the office, not as an expected feature of how the Bishop of Rome managed his relationships with the secular rulers of Western Europe. The papacy was a fixed point in the institutional landscape of Western Christianity. People traveled to Rome. Significant matters were communicated to Rome through letters and through authorized representatives. The Pope received, adjudicated, and directed from within a city whose accumulated weight of apostolic and imperial history gave every action performed there a gravity that could not be transferred or replicated elsewhere. When a pope left Rome to travel to the territories of secular rulers beyond the Italian peninsula, it was for reasons that everyone involved understood as exceptional. And the exceptionality was part of the message the journey sent, before a single ceremony had been performed, or a single negotiating term had been discussed. The situation that made the journey necessary had been developing for years and had arrived at a point where the ordinary tools of papal diplomacy had been tried and found insufficient. The Lombards had been extending their authority across the Italian peninsula for 2 generations, absorbing territories and pressing toward a consolidation that would leave the papacy as a dependent institution within a Lombard-dominated state. Their king, Aistulf. He had in 752 of the Common Era taken the city of Ravenna, which had been the administrative seat of the Byzantine Exarchate in Italy, the representative of imperial authority in the western portion of the empire. With Ravenna gone, the last meaningful buffer between Lombard expansion and direct Lombard dominance over Rome had dissolved. Aistulf was making demands on the papacy that Stephen found incompatible with any meaningful understanding of what the institution needed in order to function. He was asserting rights over the city, demanding tribute, and positioning the Lombard crown as the paramount secular authority in Italy in ways that would transform the papacy from an independent institution into a subject one. Letters had been written to Constantinople requesting Byzantine military assistance. The Byzantine emperor was managing his own considerable pressures in other parts of the empire and could not, or would not, respond in any form that addressed the immediate situation. Ambassadors had traveled to the Frankish court. Diplomatic approaches had produced discussions, but not action. The situation required Frankish soldiers. The Franks, under their new king, were the only secular power in Western Europe capable of projecting military force into Italy at a scale and with enough decisiveness that Aistulf would find genuinely persuasive. And the scale of what Stephen needed, and the scale of what he was prepared to offer in exchange. was not proportionate to what any letter or representative could adequately convey or negotiate. What the situation required was the kind of engagement that only direct, personal, face-to-face presence could create, so Stephen decided to make the crossing himself. Think for a moment about what that decision communicated before anyone arrived anywhere. A pope who crosses the Alps in autumn and travels to Frankish territory in person is a pope who has determined that what he is traveling for is important enough to justify the physical reality of several weeks of demanding travel through mountain terrain that makes no accommodation for ceremonial dignity. The cortege of attendants and vestments and documents moved at the pace of the mountains and the season, which is to say slowly, through passes that in late autumn were cold and narrow and unforgiving. The physical experience of the crossing had its own rhythm, its own accumulation of effort and patience, its own quiet space for thinking about what lay ahead. The journey was itself a form of communication. Everyone who heard about it, before a single ceremony had been performed at the destination, understood what the departure from Rome toward the Alps meant in terms of the stakes the papacy was placing on the outcome. You do not make that journey for ordinary business. Pepin received Stephen at the royal estate of Pantheon, in what is now northeastern France. In the early months of 754, the accounts of that meeting describe Pepin dismounting from his horse some distance from the approaching papal cortege and walking the final portion of the distance on foot. A gesture of deference whose symbolic content was legible to everyone present without requiring explanation. The most powerful Frankish king was demonstrating, publicly and deliberately, his understanding of the relationship he was entering and the weight he placed on the person approaching him. Picture that meeting from the perspective of anyone watching it. On one side, the man who had become king of the Franks 2 years earlier through a process that his predecessor Zachary had authorized through ambassadors. On the other side, the head of the institution whose authorization had made that kingship possible, now standing in person on Frankish soil after having made a significant physical journey to be there. The moment communicated what no formal document could have conveyed with the same clarity and economy of means. The negotiations and ceremonies that followed during Stephen's time in Frankish territory were multiple and extended across weeks of engagement, whose full content the surviving sources preserve incompletely. Stephen anointed Pepin. He did so in person, with his own hands, in a ceremony whose institutional weight was qualitatively different from what Boniface had provided at Soissons 2 years earlier. However much Boniface's anointing had genuinely mattered, Boniface had been an authorized representative of the institution, a man with documented papal commission whose ceremony carried real ecclesiastical weight. Stephen was the institution's head. The difference between an authorized representative acting on behalf of an authority and the authority acting directly is not purely ceremonial. It is structural. What the head of an institution does in person carries a different kind of weight from what a representative does in its name. And everyone who witnessed the ceremonies at Pantheon understood that difference. The anointing extended to Pepin's sons alongside him, including a boy named Charles, who would one day be known to history as Charlemagne. He received the papal anointing as a child at Pantheon in 754 of the Common Era. In circumstances he almost certainly did not fully understand at the time. The implications of that anointing would take decades to become fully visible. The extension of the endorsement to the sons was not an incidental elaboration of the ceremony. It was a structural decision with lasting consequences. The Church was not blessing Pepin as this specific, capable individual who happened to be governing the Franks at a particular moment in time. It was blessing the Carolingian claim to the Frankish throne as a dynasty, in a form that could be inherited and invoked by future generations as the foundational, legitimating act of the family's right to rule. In exchange for all of this, Pepin campaigned against the Lombards. He did so twice, in 754 and 755 of the Common Era. and both campaigns accomplished what Stephen had traveled to secure. Aistulf was pushed back from Rome, the territories secured in central Italy, centered on the former exarchate of Ravenna. Pepin donated to the papacy rather than retaining for the Frankish crown. These donations became the material foundation of what later generations called the Papal States. The Papal States mattered not only for the revenues they generated. They gave the papacy a territorial base, a piece of the Italian landscape that it administered as a secular power in its own right, independent of the goodwill of any particular secular ruler. An institution with its own territory is an institution with structural independence. That independence would shape the papacy's capacity to act as a genuine political actor in European affairs across the following centuries, sometimes with considerable consequences. Now, consider the full architecture of what had been assembled between 751 and 755. The papal endorsement that began with Zachary's answer to a carefully crafted question, deepened through Boniface's anointing at Soissons, and completed through Stephen's personal journey and the ceremonies at Pantheon, had created something the Merovingians had never possessed and could not have obtained, a legitimacy in which church involvement was not merely a recognition of something that existed independently, but one of the public conditions through which the dynasty's authority had been stabilized and made harder to contest. The Merovingians had been legitimate because of what they were. The Church had recognized and cooperated with that legitimacy for 2.5 centuries without creating it. Removing the Church from the arrangement would not, in the theory of Merovingian kingship, have dissolved the Merovingian right to rule. The Carolingian arrangement was different. What the Church had done at Soissons and Pantheon was not merely recognition. It was participation in the public establishment of a claim, and a claim publicly stabilized by institutional involvement stands in a different relationship to that institution than a claim that exists independently of it. The question of what happens when the institution becomes unhappy with the conduct of the ruler whose claim it helped establish was not being asked in 754, but it was embedded in the structure of what had been created, and it would eventually demand an answer. That answer came in January of 1077. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For 12 centuries, a pair of words has done extraordinary damage to how the Merovingian dynasty is remembered. Roi fainéant, the do-nothing kings, the idle kings. The phrase has worked so effectively and persisted so long that for most of those 12 centuries, when educated people thought about the late Merovingians at all, what they thought about was diminishment, a family that produced kings incapable of governance, whose passivity made their replacement inevitable, whose primary contribution to Frankish history was providing a vacancy for the capable men who eventually filled it. The phrase comes substantially from Einhard. Einhard wrote his biography of Charlemagne around 830 of the Common Era. Roughly 80 years after the events of 751, his career had been spent entirely at the Carolingian court. His professional existence depended on the rightness of what the Carolingians had done. His portrait of the late Merovingian kings served a specific and identifiable purpose within that context. If the men who preceded Pepin were genuinely passive and irrelevant, then what happened in 751 was not the seizure of a throne by an ambitious family that had spent 3 generations systematically preparing for that moment. It was the natural and overdue correction of an intolerable situation. The do-nothing king portrait makes Carolingian succession feel like historical necessity rather than historical choice. Before accepting the portrait as description rather than as argument, to apply the question this account has been asking throughout: whose interests does this portrait serve? And what did the person who created it need its audience to believe? The more important question is a structural one. Were the late Merovingians do-nothing kings because they were personally incapable people, or because the role they occupied had been systematically hollowed out by forces operating across 3 generations before they arrived in it? Those are genuinely different things. A man placed on a throne at the age of 3 cannot govern. The officials who govern around him accumulate precedent and expectation. When he grows up, he finds himself in a role where someone else has always made the real decisions, and where the institutional expectation that he will lead has been quietly replaced by the institutional expectation that he will preside. That is not personal failure. That is structural capture. The condition of someone who has been born into a role that has been redesigned. Through individually reasonable decisions made by capable people responding to immediate circumstances, to make genuine governance from within it nearly impossible. Einhard's portrait presents the outcome of a 3-generation process of structural capture as the result of individual inadequacy. The distinction matters for what the Carolingian transition actually was. One version is a story about people who deserve to be replaced. The other is a story about an institution being systematically disassembled from within, by people who understood what they were doing. Turn to the evidence that predates or operates independently of Carolingian influence. Dagobert I, who died in 639 of the Common Era, was the last Merovingian to exercise genuinely comprehensive political authority. He appears in sources that even Carolingian-era scribes could not entirely suppress as a genuinely active and effective ruler who managed the complex relationships of the Frankish political world with real skill. He was not a do-nothing king. His record could not be entirely rewritten because it was too recent and too widely known when those later histories were being composed. He was also the exception that proves the rule. What changed after Dagobert was not the personal quality of the kings who followed him, but the structural situation those kings were born into. Now turn from the chronicle sources entirely and look at what the ground has preserved. In 1653, of the Common Era, construction workers in the city of Tournai, in what is now Belgium, broke through soil undisturbed since the late 5th century and found a tomb, the tomb of Childeric I, father of Clovis, who had died around 481 of the Common Era. What the objects in that tomb communicate about the civilization that produced them is incompatible with any straightforward application of the phrase Dark Ages. A golden ring inscribed with words identifying the man inside as King Childeric. Weapons fitted with gold at a level of technical precision that experts examining them in the 17th century recognized immediately as exceptional, requiring craftsmen with specialized skills developed through years of continuous practice. Byzantine coin, minted in Constantinople, present in a Germanic chieftain's tomb in what is now Belgium. Those coins do not arrive there by accident. They arrive through commercial networks, through exchange relationships that connected the Frankish world to the Mediterranean economy across thousands of miles, maintaining the kind of active commercial contact that required ongoing organization, trust, and institutional infrastructure to sustain, and approximately 300 small golden objects shaped like bees or possibly cicadas, produced with a fineness of technique that specialists consistently describe as extraordinary. The cloisonné work required to create objects of that quality demanded access to gold, to precious stones, to specialized tools, and to craftsmen who had mastered a demanding tradition through years of transmission. A civilization that produced these objects was operating a sophisticated craft economy connected to trade networks of considerable reach. In 1953, of the Common Era, archaeologists working beneath Cologne Cathedral opened a burial chamber sealed for roughly 1,400 years and found a young man of the Frankish royal family, buried with a golden cloak pin set with garnets, weapons decorated with gold fittings, and gilded helmet fittings of exceptional quality. This was not an isolated discovery. Thousands of Merovingian-era graves excavated across northern Gaul and the Rhineland over the past century and a half have revealed, in aggregate, a civilization more materially sophisticated and more commercially connected than the phrase Dark Ages was ever designed to accommodate. The garnet work found in aristocratic Merovingian burials is particularly telling about the reach of those commercial connections. Creating intricate polychrome metalwork by setting gemstones into small cells formed from gold required access to materials, tools, and skills that could only be sustained through active participation in long-distance trade networks. The materials in some of the finest examples of this work, based on compositional analysis of surviving pieces, came from sources far beyond the Rhine Valley, reaching through trade networks that connected Frankish workshops to distant supply chains. The dynasty was not isolated from the wider world. It was embedded in it. The distribution of Merovingian gold coinage confirms this picture. These small coins have been found not only across Frankish territory but in England, in Scandinavia, along the North Sea coast, and at trading sites through the Low Countries and northern Germany. They circulate because genuine trade is happening across wide enough distances to require a shared medium of exchange. Their distribution traces a North Sea and English Channel commercial network of real significance. Frankish weapons, wine, and glassware moved north. English wool and tin moved south. The movement was organized and sustained over generations. Set this material evidence against the do-nothing king portrait, and ask the structural question again. If the Merovingians were as irrelevant as Einhard needed his readers to believe, why did the Carolingians spend 3 generations preparing to replace them? Why did Pepin need a carefully crafted papal answer to justify what he did? Why did the Frankish nobility still require a Merovingian on the throne as late as 743, a decade before the formal deposition? Why was the transition staged with the elaborate sequence of Soissons and papal anointing and Stephen's personal journey, rather than simply announced as the natural order correcting itself? Because the symbolic currency of Merovingian legitimacy still carried genuine value that raw Carolingian power alone could not replace. Because displacing the dynasty required 3 generations of preparation and the active involvement of the papacy. Because the do-nothing king portrait is what the winning side needed to be believed, not a description of what the dynasty actually was across its full span and its full history. In 591 of the Common Era, Pope Gregory I wrote a letter to a Frankish queen. The queen was Brunhilde, regent of Austrasia, governing on behalf of her young grandson after years of political difficulty that had cost her much of the direct power she had previously exercised. Gregory's letter was warm in its register and genuine in its respect. It acknowledged the challenges of her position. It praised her demonstrated commitment to the Church's interests. It expressed real confidence in her as a partner in the ongoing work of aligning Frankish ecclesiastical practice with the standards Rome had consistently advocated. Gregory I was one of the most capable administrators the medieval Church ever produced. He did not write letters of this kind carelessly or out of mere courtesy. The exchange is worth beginning with because of the specific contrast it creates. 160 years before the ceremony at Soissons, the most powerful bishop in the Western world was writing to a Frankish queen regent as a genuine institutional partner, as someone whose active cooperation the Church needed and actively cultivated, not as a subject seeking favor, not as a petitioner requesting guidance, as a partner. What happened between that letter and Soissons was not betrayal. Using the word betrayal to describe the transformation misrepresents what actually occurred and why. What happened was something considerably more instructive about how institutions operate over time, how the alignment of institutional interests shifts as circumstances change, and how partnerships that formed productively in one set of conditions redirect themselves when those conditions are replaced by conditions that make different partnerships more productive. The original arrangement between Clovis and the Gallo-Roman bishops was practical on both sides in ways that both parties understood clearly. The bishops needed military protection, an institution managing populations and properties across a large territory, without the capacity to defend those things against armed men who constituted the primary alternative source of authority in the post-Roman landscape, was permanently vulnerable to disruptions that threatened its capacity to function at all. The disorder that followed the dissolution of Roman political authority was not merely uncomfortable for the Church, it was existentially threatening to the institution's ability to do what it existed to do. Clovis needed administrative capacity. He had conquered territory. To govern it, he needed people who could manage records, adjudicate disputes, coordinate the logistical and communicative functions that large-scale governance requires, and provide the institutional continuity that turns military conquest into durable political authority. Those people were in the Church. The exchange was understood by both parties, and both benefited from it for several generations. The deterioration came gradually, through a mechanism visible in many institutional relationships over long periods of time. From the Crown's perspective, church appointments were a resource to be managed like any other. A bishop controlled significant land and commanded local loyalty. Appointing a politically reliable man to an episcopal position was simply what a competent ruler did with available tools. The practice was rational from a governance perspective. From the Church's perspective, the same practice was the systematic corruption of the institution's capacity to fulfill its own purposes. Bishops were supposed to be chosen through processes that gave appropriate weight to spiritual qualifications and canonical procedure. When kings filled episcopal positions with military companions, relatives, or men who had paid enough for the privilege, the Church gained administrators who served the crown and were qualified for almost nothing else. The practice of purchasing church offices, known as simony, spread through the Frankish Church during the 6th and 7th centuries. Monasteries were being managed as family estates. The gap between what the Church was supposed to be and what it had become inside the Merovingian arrangement widened steadily. An Irish monk named Columbanus arrived in Frankish territory around 590 of the Common Era and refused to accept any of this. He founded monasteries operating by a rule of strict discipline and refused to accept royal interference in their governance. He clashed publicly with Frankish bishops who found his standards inconvenient. He was eventually expelled from Frankish territory. The monasteries he had founded continued after his departure, because the model they represented had taken root in the Frankish landscape in ways that survived the removal of their founder. Picture a Frankish bishop in the early 7th century receiving a letter from one of these reformed monasteries, written in careful Latin by a hand that reflects genuine classical education, criticizing the bishop's appointment procedures, invoking canonical standards that Rome has consistently advocated, carrying the authority of a community that has deliberately positioned itself apart from the compromises that constitute the bishop's own career. That letter is a small piece of a much larger realignment taking shape around the bishop. A realignment that will gradually make the Merovingian way of managing church-crown relations look less like governance and more like institutional decay. Boniface carried the reform impulse further and gave it something approaching systematic form. Authorized by Pope Gregory II to organize and reform the Church in Germanic territories, Boniface convened councils, established proper canonical procedures, and built a network of reformed institutions aligned with Roman norms in ways that previous efforts had not managed to sustain at scale. In 742 of the Common Era, a council of Frankish bishops and clergy met and addressed the accumulated problems of ecclesiastical appointments, monastic governance, and church practice that the reform movement had been identifying and pressing for decades. The council issued decisions that moved the Frankish Church measurably closer to the standards Rome had consistently requested. In 747 of the Common Era, a second council continued this work with similar seriousness and similar concrete outcomes. Neither council was convened by any Merovingian king. Both were convened by Carloman and Pepin, who at that point still held the formal title of Mayor of the Palace and were officially serving under the nominal authority of Childeric III on his ceremonial throne. The Carolingians were not merely tolerating the reform movement or permitting it to proceed in their territories. They were hosting its assemblies, providing the political framework within which its agenda could be pursued, and positioning themselves to Rome as the Frankish lay authorities committed to delivering what the Merovingian arrangement had consistently failed to produce. Every council convened under Carolingian sponsorship was evidence delivered directly to the papacy. The family that currently held real power in the Frankish territories was the family that would deliver the properly ordered church. The appointments made on appropriate grounds. The monasteries governed by people committed to religious life that Rome had been requesting and the Merovingian system had been failing to provide adequately for generations. Gregory I had written to Brunhilde in 591, because at that moment the Merovingian royal connection was the best available instrument for the ecclesiastical improvement Rome wanted. 160 years later, that assessment had changed. Not because the Church had abandoned its commitments or betrayed a partnership in any simple sense, but because the landscape had changed. The institutional interests that had always shaped the Church's choices were now better served by a different alignment. And the more useful partner had become the family that had been cultivating that partnership for years. The Merovingians had built the Church-Crown alliance. They had used it without fully reckoning with what the institution they had partnered with was becoming, as it developed its own theory of its own authority and its own understanding of what it needed from secular partners. By the time that reckoning was unavoidable, the Carolingians had been preparing to step into the vacancy for a generation. Pepin the Short died in 768 of the Common Era, 17 years after he had become the first Carolingian to hold the Frankish crown, rather than merely the practical reality of power behind it. Those 17 years had been successful by any reasonable measure. The dynasty had been consolidated against the challenges that invariably accompany a change of ruling family. The papal alliance had been maintained and deepened through the Italian campaigns and the donation that created the Papal States. Carolingian authority had been established firmly enough that no serious attempt to restore the Merovingians emerged during his reign, and no challenge to the dynasty's legitimacy developed into anything dangerous. Then, as he prepared to die, Pepin made the decision that generations of Frankish cultural expectation required of him, and that the logic of the dynasty's own history should have given him reason to approach with considerable care. He divided the kingdom between his two surviving sons. His elder son, Carloman, received territories in the eastern and central portions of the Frankish world, including Burgundy, Alemannia, and portions of Austrasia. His younger son, Charles, received the northern and western portions, including Neustria and the Atlantic regions that had been the traditional core of Frankish political life. Both sons were old enough to govern. Both had been educated in the Frankish court. Both had received the papal anointing alongside their father during Stephen's visit years earlier. The division was geographically coherent and defensible by the standards the Frankish world recognized. Anyone who has been following this story carefully since the second chapter will recognize the structure of what just happened. Geographically coherent, defensible by the standards of Frankish inheritance practice. These are precisely the descriptions that would have applied to Clovis's division of the kingdom among his 4 sons in 511 of the Common Era. The decision that had set in motion 2.5 centuries of partition and civil conflict, whose structural consequences the Pepinids had exploited to build their power. The dynasty that had spent 3 generations capitalizing on the vulnerabilities created by Merovingian partition was, in the first generation of its own dynastic rule, reproducing the same structural decision that had made those vulnerabilities possible. The reason Pepin made this choice was not ignorance. He had governed the consequences of partition his entire career, He made this choice because the concept that a kingdom was categorically different from a private estate, something with an institutional integrity too consequential to divide, was still being forged in the Church's emerging theory of anointed kingship. It had not yet been embedded deeply enough in Frankish political practice to override the inheritance logic that Frankish culture had always applied to a man's possessions when he died. Pepin applied the logic his world gave him, as Clovis had done before him, to a situation that logic was not equipped to handle. The division stood. The sources record tensions between Carloman and Charles. The low-level friction that divided kingdoms between brothers generate reliably, as each court develops its own advisors and its own perspective on questions that affect both territories. The structural tensions were real and visible, and they were the inevitable product of the partition that Pepin had imposed. Then, in 771 of the Common Era, 3 years after Pepin's death, Carloman died. He died from illness, leaving a widow and young children with legitimate claims on the territories he had governed. Charles moved to absorb his brother's territories rather than allowing the division to continue on terms that recognized Carloman's heirs. Carloman's widow fled with her children, seeking protection from a secular power that had reasons of its own to resist Carolingian consolidation. Charles ignored the claims and governed the reunited Frankish kingdom as sole king. The crisis that the partition had prepared for did not materialize because one of its two principals died before the structural tensions had time to harden into open and sustained military conflict. Whether the Carolingian succession would ultimately have avoided the Merovingian pattern, had Carloman lived a full lifetime, is a question the evidence does not allow us to answer with certainty. Some structural differences existed between the Carolingian situation and the Merovingian one. The more formally defined church relationship and the papacy's genuine institutional interest in Carolingian stability might have moderated the consequences of partition. Whether those factors would have been sufficient over decades of growing divergence between two separate royal courts with separate interests and separate advisors is genuinely unknown. What the record shows clearly is that the dynasty, which had criticized its predecessors for a structural choice that weakened dynasties, made the same structural choice at the first available opportunity and was spared the immediate consequences by a death. Charles governed the reunited kingdom with an effectiveness the Frankish world had not seen for a long time. He campaigned continuously and successfully across an enormous arc of territory, from the Saxon lands in the north to the borders of the Carolingian world in multiple directions. He built administrative systems of genuine sophistication. He engaged with ecclesiastical reform in ways that deepened the relationship between the Carolingian dynasty and the institutional church that his father had carefully cultivated. On Christmas Day of 800 of the Common Era, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charles's head in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, and the assembled congregation hailed him as Emperor of the Romans in the ancient Roman formula, repeated 3 times, the most visible expression of everything the Carolingian project had been building toward since Pepin's question went to Rome half a century earlier. When Charlemagne died in 814, his son Louis, called Louis the Pious, inherited the unified empire. Louis the Pious had 3 sons who survived him. In 843 of the Common Era, those 3 sons, after years of conflict over their shares of the inheritance, signed the Treaty of Verdun, dividing the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts. The zones that Verdun formalized were not yet France and Germany in any modern sense. They were political and cultural territories whose later development would move in those directions, following tracks that had been laid down long before the treaty was signed. Some of the cultural and institutional differences that later helped make those boundaries meaningful, the broad distinction between the more thoroughly Romanized Western territories and the more Germanic Eastern ones, had been present and consolidating throughout the Merovingian centuries. The east-west division that Verdun traced in 843 was not created by that treaty. it was given formal political expression by it, expressing differences that the Merovingians had governed across for 2.5 centuries without dissolving. The Carolingians had replaced the Merovingians, built magnificently on foundations the Merovingians had laid, reproduced the structural errors the Merovingians had made, been saved from immediate consequences by contingency, and generated at Verdun a division whose broad shape echoed the divisions the Merovingians had never quite managed to overcome. Christmas Day, 800 of the Common Era. The Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. Charlemagne kneels at the altar. Pope Leo III approaches and places a crown on the kneeling man's head. The assembled congregation hails him in the ancient Roman formula of acclamation, repeated 3 times, a ceremony that seemed to contemporaries and to later historians alike to mark the crossing of a threshold between one era and another. Before examining what that moment meant, consider what was required to make it possible. Charlemagne stood at that altar because he was king of the Franks. He was king of the Franks because his father Pepin had received the sequence of endorsements that converted Carolingian military dominance into recognized royal authority, beginning with Zachary's answer to a carefully crafted question and extending through Soissons and Ponthion and the Italian campaigns. Those endorsements had been possible because 3 generations of Pepinid work had built the institutional networks and the position from which the move could be made, and all of it was built on the Frankish kingdom that Clovis had created, organized through the church-crown alliance Clovis had established, distributed across a territorial geography that 2.5 centuries of Merovingian governance had shaped and consolidated. The territory Charlemagne ruled was Merovingian territory. The ecclesiastical network that gave him administrative reach throughout his realm was built through the Merovingian church partnership. The cultural and linguistic geography of his kingdom was geography the Merovingians had governed for 2.5 centuries without dissolving. The Carolingian Renaissance. The intellectual and artistic activity associated with Charlemagne's court was genuine and had lasting consequences. Manuscripts were collected and copied. Classical texts were preserved and transmitted in forms that mattered for later European intellectual history. Latin literacy was extended and standardized across the kingdom's administrative and ecclesiastical networks. Palace schools were established. A network of educated administrators was cultivated. These achievements were real, but the manuscripts the Carolingian scholars collected had to exist somewhere before they could be collected. The monasteries that preserved those manuscripts across the preceding centuries had been established and endowed through the Merovingian period, supported by the same church-crown alliance that the Merovingians had invented and the Carolingians had inherited. The scribal traditions that made manuscript production possible had been maintained through Merovingian patronage across generations of practitioners who had transmitted the skills from master to student across the same centuries that Einhard described as the era of do-nothing kings. The episcopal network through which Carolingian administrative reform operated was a network whose territorial boundaries had been drawn during Merovingian governance and had persisted through the political transition. The Carolingian Renaissance was built substantially in a library the Merovingians had stocked, through institutions the Merovingians had founded and endowed, using skills and traditions that Merovingian patronage and Merovingian governance had sustained across 2.5 centuries of allegedly do-nothing rule. Charlemagne built magnificently. He built on a foundation, and the foundation was largely Merovingian. And acknowledging that does not diminish what he accomplished. It simply locates his achievement accurately in the longer history that made it possible. The Salic Law is the most direct and most unexpected example of how the Merovingian foundation kept producing effects long after the dynasty itself was gone. Clovis commissioned a law code sometime around 507 of the Common Era. The Salic Law was a practical document addressing the immediate governance needs of the Frankish community, compensation rates for various kinds of harm, inheritance procedures for certain categories of Frankish land, dispute resolution mechanisms for the specific conflicts that arose in that particular kind of early medieval community. It was not constitutional legislation. It was not designed to operate as a framework for determining who could inherit the throne of a major European kingdom. The people who drafted it were thinking about local property disputes among Frankish families, not about royal succession problems 8 centuries in the future. One of its provisions concerned the inheritance of a particular category of Frankish land called Salic land, and excluded women from that inheritance. This was a practical rule about agricultural landholding in a specific kind of early medieval community, reflecting the assumptions of a Germanic warrior society whose relationship to land was organized around military service, and whose inheritance, customs, reflected that organization. 8 centuries later, this provision became central to one of the most consequential succession disputes in European history. When the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty ended in the early 14th century, competing claims to the French throne emerged. English kings, whose connection to the French royal line ran through a female ancestor, had claims that French legal theorists needed to counter. Reaching back through accumulated medieval legal tradition, those theorists found the Salic provision. The argument that Frankish custom excluded female inheritance, and therefore excluded claims derived through a female line, became part of the legal foundation of the French position in the dynastic conflict that triggered the 100 Years' War. A conflict that ran from 1337 to 1453 of the Common Era and was among the most destructive events of medieval European history. The argument was contestable. The provision had almost certainly never been intended to govern royal succession at all, but it became foundational to a conflict that killed vast numbers of people, reshaped the political landscape of Western Europe across more than a century, and produced figures whose names remained familiar 7 centuries after the war ended. A practical administrative provision drafted for a specific Frankish community in the early 6th century became, 9 centuries later, a weapon in a dynastic war of enormous consequence. That is how the Merovingian legacy actually worked. Not through monuments that announced themselves, or through institutions that consciously traced their founding to the dynasty, but through the absorbed persistence of things the Merovingians had built for immediate purposes, embedded so thoroughly in the structures that followed them that those structures could no longer be cleanly separated from their foundations. The network of bishoprics organized across Frankish territory during the Merovingian and early Carolingian periods helped create the administrative skeleton of the medieval Western Church. The boundaries of those episcopal sees, drawn in response to the population distributions and road networks and administrative habits of the late Roman and early Frankish world, persisted across centuries of political upheaval because ecclesiastical institutions were more stable than secular political arrangements. Some of those boundaries persisted in various forms until the Reformation and, in certain cases, considerably beyond it. These were Merovingian creations absorbed into the permanent institutional structure of the medieval church. Carrying the dynasty's organizational decisions forward through centuries, the dynasty did not live to see. Charlemagne is remembered. The coronation of 800 is in every general history of the period. The Merovingians are the predecessors. The before picture. The context against which Carolingian achievement is measured. What the before picture actually shows, read carefully and honestly, is that the achievement was built on foundations the Carolingians inherited, used with considerable skill, and in most cases did not acknowledge. January of 1077 of the Common Era, the castle of Canossa stands on a promontory in what is now the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. High ground owned by the Countess Matilda of Tuscany, one of the most powerful secular figures in the Italian peninsula. In January, at that elevation, the cold is the kind that settles into stone and does not yield until spring. It was in that cold, in the courtyard of that castle, that one of the most discussed scenes in medieval European history took place. Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, stood barefoot in the snow. He stood there for 3 days. The man inside the castle, who had excommunicated Henry 6 months earlier, and whose lifting of that excommunication Henry was standing in the snow to request, was Pope Gregory VII, born Hildebrand of Soissons, one of the most consequential figures in the entire history of the medieval papacy. A man who had spent his career building the institutional authority of the papal office and who understood, with absolute clarity, what the authority he now held actually meant. The excommunication had created a situation Henry could not govern around. In Gregory's articulation of his claim, a king who had been formally excommunicated by the Pope was a king whose subjects could be treated as no longer bound by their oaths of loyalty to him. Whatever the precise legal and theological status of that claim, and it was contested, the political effect was real. The German princes who had been looking for an opportunity to challenge Henry's authority seized on the excommunication as their justification. If the excommunication held, Henry would lose his kingdom. The only path back to political viability ran through the man who had issued the excommunication. He stood in the snow for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Gregory received him, heard his penance, and lifted the excommunication. Henry returned to Germany and resumed his contest with both the Pope and the German princes. The conflict was not resolved at Canossa. Gregory's political gains from the scene proved temporary as both men resumed the underlying contest, which continued for years afterward, and that neither would fully win before they died. But the scene in the courtyard is not important primarily for what it resolved. It is important for what it made visible. 326 years had passed since Pepin's ambassadors carried their carefully worded question to Rome in 750 of the Common Era. In those 3¼ centuries, the structural change introduced by the events at Soissons and Pantheon had been working through its implications in the political theology and the political practice of the Western world. The scene at Canossa was one of those implications, presented in its most visible and most dramatic form. The Merovingian kings had derived their right to rule from what they were. Their legitimacy was grounded in the blood of the family, in the quality the origin myth maintained, as inscribed in Merovingian nature from the dynasty's founding. That quality existed independently of any institution's recognition or endorsement. The Church had recognized and cooperated with Merovingian legitimacy for 2½ centuries without creating it. In the theory of Merovingian kingship, the Church was a partner of a legitimacy that existed independently of its involvement. Removing the Church from the arrangement would not have dissolved the Merovingian right to rule. The Carolingian claim had been publicly established and stabilized at its key moments by acts of institutional endorsement. Each ceremony, from Zachary's answer, through Boniface's anointing at Soissons, through Stephen's personal journey, and the ceremonies at Pantheon, had made the relationship between Carolingian kingship and church involvement more explicit and more foundational to what the dynasty's authority actually rested on. The Church was not simply recognizing something that existed independently of it. It had become one of the public conditions through which Carolingian authority was stabilized and made harder to contest. A king whose legitimacy is grounded in his own nature cannot have that legitimacy revoked by any institution. What is inscribed in blood and origin is not subject to institutional cancellation. A king whose legitimacy has been publicly stabilized by institutional endorsement stands in a different relationship to that institution. The question of what happens when the endorsing institution becomes unhappy with the endorsed king's conduct and decides that the terms of the arrangement have been violated is not one that was being asked at Soissons or Pantheon. It accumulated in the structure of the Western political order over 3 centuries, working through its implications, until it presented itself at Canossa for an explicit answer. Whatever Henry's private motivations for standing in the snow on those specific days, whatever strategic calculations he was making about his situation with the German princes and his paths toward political recovery, The scene is only possible, only intelligible, only carries the weight it carries, within a political culture whose deepest assumptions about the relationship between sacred and secular authority had been shaped, among other things, by the precedents established at Soissons and Ponthion 3 centuries earlier. The Carolingian transition had introduced a structural change into Western political thought, and Canossa was one moment in which that change demonstrated its consequences in the most direct possible form. The investiture controversy that produced the confrontation between Henry and Gregory was ostensibly about who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots, a question with concrete practical stakes for both secular rulers and the Church. But underneath the specific dispute about appointment procedures ran the question embedded in Western political theory since 751. Which authority was ultimately supreme, the spiritual or the temporal? If the Church had participated in publicly establishing secular authority, what ongoing standing did it have in relation to that authority's conduct? The investiture controversy was not resolved at Canossa. Henry and Gregory resumed their conflict afterward, and neither lived to see a resolution. The Concordat of Worms, in 1122, negotiated a procedural compromise on episcopal appointments that satisfied neither party completely and left the underlying theological and political questions intact. Those questions ran through multiple subsequent conflicts between secular rulers and the papacy across the following centuries, generating real and costly confrontations, because they were embedded in the foundations of the Western political order in ways that made them unavoidable. The men who arranged what happened at Soissons were solving an immediate practical problem. They could not have anticipated Henry standing in the snow 3 centuries later. But the solution they found built into the foundations of the world they were creating a structural tension that their successors would spend several centuries trying to resolve. There is a kind of historical confidence that comes with distance and with the construction of coherent narrative. And that careful attention to the limits of the evidence consistently complicates, 14 centuries removed from the events this account has been tracing. It is possible to construct a story that moves from Clovis to Pepin to Charlemagne to Canossa with the satisfying arc of something that knows where it is going and arrives where it intended. The documents have been examined. The archaeology has been considered. The arguments have been made and weighed against each other. That confidence requires one honest qualification. The account offered here is the best current approximation of what happened. Based on available evidence and available analytical frameworks, parts of it will be revised when evidence currently inaccessible becomes available. Parts of it will be revised when new frameworks allow historians to see things in existing evidence that current frameworks miss. Some of the questions at the center of the story remain genuinely open, not merely because of the fragility of medieval documentation, though that fragility is real and significant, but because they concern things the surviving evidence was never designed to preserve. The most fundamental open question concerns the nature of the Carolingian project itself. Did the Pepinids plan what they accomplished across 3 generations? Did Pepin of Landen, building his network of relationships in Austrasia in the early 7th century, have any sense of where those investments might eventually lead? Did Pepin of Herstal, declining to reach for the crown after Tertry, understand himself as deferring to a later generation what his own generation could not yet safely accomplish? Did Charles Martel, governing without a king for 4 years after Theudoric's death, understand that demonstration as preparation for a transition he expected his sons to make? The sources do not allow us to answer these questions. They show us what each generation did in its own circumstances. They do not preserve what each generation intended beyond those circumstances. The trajectory that looks, from the end, like a deliberate multi-generational plan may have been assembled forward, one pragmatic response to immediate pressures at a time. With no single generation having clear visibility into the cumulative destination, both interpretations remain consistent with the available evidence. a deliberate long-term project, a series of individually sensible decisions that accumulated into a result that looks designed. The honest intellectual position is that the sources cannot determine which is more accurate, and that claims of certainty in either direction go beyond what the evidence can support. The second open question concerns the women who shaped the transition period and whose roles the surviving record handles inadequately. Plectrude managed the succession crisis of 714 with enough effectiveness to constitute a genuine obstacle to Charles Martel's consolidation for several years. She was not a passive figure swept aside by larger forces. She had resources, allies, and a clear understanding of what she was trying to accomplish and a realistic prospect of accomplishing it. The sources treat her primarily as the obstacle that Charles overcame. They do not preserve how she understood her own situation, what networks she was working through, what she believed the stakes were from inside the conflict rather than from the external perspective the chroniclers occupied. The political marriages of the Merovingian and early Carolingian periods connected family networks and regional power bases in ways that shaped access to resources and allies at the moments when critical decisions were being made. The women at the center of those marriages appear in the sources only when they intersect with events the male chroniclers found worth recording. The rest of their activity, their management of households and properties and relationships that shaped the range of options available to the men the sources describe, is largely invisible in what has survived. The third open question concerns Childeric III most directly. After he entered the monastery at Sithiu in 751, the record about him grows thin. His death is not documented in any source that survives. The name he may have taken upon entering religious life is not preserved. The character of his daily existence in the institution that became his permanent home is absent from what has come down to us. The thinness of this record is consistent with two explanations that are not mutually exclusive. The ordinary fragility of 8th century documentation, which was radically incomplete and which preserved information about private individuals in religious institutions inconsistently for practical administrative reasons, and the interests of a new dynasty in a former king who existed in the record as a concluded matter, rather than a continuing presence whose specific details might provide material for those who wished to contest the new order. Both factors were almost certainly present. How the balance between them shaped what was or was not preserved cannot be determined from the evidence that remains. The fourth open question is where active scientific research is producing the most interesting current results. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed early medieval population studies substantially in recent years. Studies of ancient genomes from sites across Europe have produced pictures of population, movement, and admixture that complement and sometimes substantially revise what documentary sources suggest. For the Merovingian period specifically, this work has begun to illuminate the genetic composition of Frankish populations and the degree of biological interaction between Frankish settlers and the Gallo-Roman populations they governed, and eventually merged with, across the Merovingian centuries. What has not yet been produced is a confirmed genetic profile of the Merovingian royal line itself, the tomb of Childeric I. The most obvious starting point for such a project had most of its physical material stolen in 1831 of the Common Era. The golden bees, the weapons, the ring, the Byzantine quines, the skeletal material most valuable for ancient DNA analysis. Most of what made the Childeric tomb the most famous Merovingian archaeological discovery is gone, dispersed, and in most cases destroyed, available only in the documentation and illustrations produced before the theft. Other potential Merovingian royal burial sites face their own challenges of location uncertainty, preservation conditions, or restricted access that have so far prevented the kind of analysis that could produce a confirmed royal genetic profile. The methodology continues to improve rapidly. When confirmed Merovingian royal material becomes available for analysis, The results have genuine potential to answer questions about family relationships and biological ancestry that no documentary source can address. The fifth open question is the one that no methodology can fully resolve, because it concerns interior experience. And the evidence for interior experience is, by definition, whatever the experiencing person chose to express, and whatever of that expression has survived. What did the Merovingian kings of the later period actually understand about their situation? We do not know what Childeric III experienced during the 8 years between his retrieval from a monastery in 743 and his return to a monastery in 751. We do not know whether he understood what was happening around him and what role had been prepared for him. We do not know whether his experience of those 8 years felt, from inside it, like captivity or accommodation, or simply the life that had been arranged for him and that he inhabited, without having been given any genuine choice in the matter. The sources cannot answer this. The interior life of a deposed king in the 8th century is not what any chronicler of that period was trying to preserve. What they preserved was the external record, and the external record has been the subject of this account. A man taken from a monastery and placed on a throne. A man taken from a throne and returned to a monastery. A dynasty ended by the instrument its founders had invented. An institution that had been a partner of Merovingian legitimacy for 2.5 centuries, becoming one of the public conditions through which a different family's authority was established and stabilized. The record is rich enough to sustain serious historical analysis across 14 chapters. It is not rich enough to close the questions at its center. That limitation is not a failure. It is an honest description of what 14 centuries of evidence can and cannot tell us. Return to the image where this story began. A king in an ox cart, moving at the pace of farm animals through his own kingdom, ceremonially present, going through the motions of a royal progress through territory he nominally rules, while the man who actually governs moves in a different direction towards something that matters. The king in the cart and the mayor who governs are two different men, and the kingdom has organized itself around the second one. The first one is there because the tradition requires someone in that position, and someone with the right blood occupies it. And the form is being observed even as the substance operates somewhere else entirely. Einhard's image, created by a Carolingian court scholar to make the dynasty his patrons had replaced appear as naturally unsuited for power as words could make them appear. The image that has followed the Merovingians through 12 centuries of historical writing, shaping how millions of people have understood this dynasty and this transition. 15 chapters of this account have been the context that image was designed to prevent, the context that shows Merovingian legitimacy as a real and functioning thing, built through 2.5 centuries of continuous investment in a symbolic system that had genuine practical effectiveness within the world it was designed for. The context that shows the Carolingian transition as a political achievement of real sophistication rather than the obvious outcome of Merovingian inadequacy. The context that shows the physical world of the dynasty, in the golden bees and the Byzantine coins and the garnet metalwork and the North Sea trade networks, documented by the distribution of Merovingian coinage. As the product of a civilization that was doing considerably more than the phrase Dark Ages was ever designed to acknowledge. In that context, the image of the man in the ox cart looks different. He was the last visible expression of a theory of power that had organized the Frankish political world since before Clovis. The theory was that authority flows from what a person is, that something had been inscribed in the nature of a specific family at its founding that created a different category of being, one that could not be manufactured by any institutional process or revoked by any institutional decision. The king in the ox cart carried that quality, whether he was governing or merely presiding, whether the world around him fully recognized what he was or not, whether he was moving at the pace of a military column or the pace of farm animals pulling a cart through the Frankish countryside. That theory had worked for 2.5 centuries. It had worked through civil wars and partitions and the slow dissolution of the Roman institutional world that had surrounded the dynasty's founding. It had given the Frankish political order a framework for understanding legitimate authority that was stable enough to persist through enormous external changes and specific enough to be recognizable and enforceable in the situations where it was tested. What it could not do was adapt when the world that had sustained it moved on. The world of 751 was not the world of 481. In those 2.5 centuries, the church that Clovis had allied with had become something qualitatively different from what it had been when Clovis made his strategic theological choice. It had developed a more sophisticated theory of its own institutional authority. It had a clearer understanding of its role in the political order of the Western world. It had, through the reform movement and the development of papal institutional authority, a greater confidence that church recognition was not merely an acknowledgement of secular authority that existed independently of it, but was one of the public conditions through which legitimate secular authority could be stabilized, recognized, and made harder to contest. The Merovingian theory of legitimacy had been designed for a world where the church was a practical partner rather than an institution with claims to participate in the public establishment of secular authority. It was not designed to remain persuasive in a world where that same church had developed both the theory and the institutional capacity to act as something considerably more. The Carolingians did not defeat the old theory in argument. They built a new theory alongside it, sustained it through 3 generations of deliberate institutional investment, and waited for the conditions that had sustained the old theory to dissolve sufficiently that the transition could be made. Through a legal question, an ecclesiastical ceremony, a choice of location, a pope's personal journey through autumn mountains, 3 years of military campaigns in Italy, a donation of conquered territory to the institution that had provided the endorsement. The transition from one theory of legitimate authority to another was the deepest consequence of 751. More consequential than the replacement of one family with another. More consequential than the specific careers of the individuals involved. A consequence that ran 3 centuries forward to a courtyard in Canossa, and further forward than that, into the prolonged contest between sacred and secular authority that occupied much of medieval European political life. The men at Soissons were not thinking about any of this. They were solving an immediate practical problem in the most effective way available to them. They could not have anticipated Henry standing in the snow 3 centuries later. The unintended structural consequence of how they solved their problem accumulated in the foundations of the world they built. Now, consider what the dynasty they replaced had built, and how it outlasted them. In 1653 of the Common Era, those construction workers in Tournai broke through soil, undisturbed since 481, and found the golden bees of Childeric I, buried with Byzantine coins and gold-fitted weapons, and a ring that announced who the man in the ground had been. The objects survived 1172 years of silence in that tomb. In 1804 of the Common Era, Napoleon Bonaparte stood in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, wearing coronation robes embroidered with those golden bees. He had reached across 13 centuries of intervening dynasties and political changes to claim a connection to what he understood as the oldest and deepest root of Frankish royal authority. Not the Carolingians who had anointed themselves with papal endorsement, not the Capetians who had followed the Carolingians, the original dynasty, the one that had built the symbolic language of Frankish kingship before the Carolingians existed, before the papal endorsement had been invented as a mechanism for establishing royal legitimacy, before any of the elaborate architecture of the 751 transition had been conceived. 13 centuries, from a tomb in Belgium to a ceremony in Paris, the same objects, doing the same work, announcing that the person who displayed them belonged to a tradition that predated and transcended everything that had tried to displace it. That is what durable symbolic systems do. They outlast the historical circumstances that produced them. They remain available across vast stretches of time for retrieval by people in entirely different contexts who recognize that the symbol speaks to something they need, said. The Merovingians built that kind of symbol. The long hair and the sacred blood, and the mythological origin, and the golden objects placed with their dead to announce what they were and what tradition they embodied. The dynasty itself is gone. The symbols persisted through 13 centuries of political change and continued doing political work, in a ceremony 13 centuries after the dynasty that created them had been dissolved by the very instrument it had invented. The dynasty had also built more than its symbols. The territorial organization of the Frankish world, the episcopal network of the medieval Western Church, whose boundaries had been drawn during Merovingian governance, the cultural and linguistic geography whose contours helped define the political zones that became France and Germany over centuries of subsequent development, the legal provision that contributed to a war fought 9 centuries after it was written, the institutional partnership with the Church that the Carolingians inherited, perfected, used to their advantage, and passed on to a European political order that spent several more centuries working out what it had received. These were the things the scissors could not cut. They dissolved into the foundation of the world that followed and became invisible within it, which is the surest sign of how thoroughly they had been absorbed. The Merovingian dynasty built things that lasted long after the dynasty itself was gone, built them in ways that made the building invisible, made the foundation unacknowledged, made the inheritance look like original achievement in the hands of those who received it. The question underneath this entire story is not really about 2 specific dynasties in 8th century Gaul. It is about why anyone has the right to hold power over others. What makes authority legitimate rather than merely forceful? What happens when the story that made power feel right runs out of the conditions that had made it persuasive? And a new story has to be built from different foundations. And the people who build the new story cannot fully see what they are building into the structure of the world they are creating. And the people who live in the world they created spend centuries discovering the consequences. The Merovingians answered the question of legitimate authority with blood and hair and mythological origin. Their answer worked for 2.5 centuries. The Carolingians answered it with institutional endorsement and ecclesiastical ceremony and a pope's personal journey over autumn mountains. Their answer worked for longer and generated different consequences. Later answers used different vocabularies. The question underneath all of them is the same question in different forms. Childeric III walked through the gate of the monastery at Sithiu in 751 of the Common Era. The record went quiet around him. The dynasty he represented dissolved into the invisible foundations of the world that came after, shaping it from within without being visible as a shaping force in anything the world could name or acknowledge. The scissors closed in 751. But what they cut, and what they could not, is still being sorted out.